Good afternoon, my friends. Grim here. I hope everybody's doing well today. Thank you so much for watching yet another spoiler video. This one is about Takenuma, Abandoned Mire, which is part of this channeling legendary land monocolored mana producing cycle that has got everybody talking, and in this case, of course, it produces black mana. I'm actually relatively excited about this land. Now, right up front, I'll tell you, I think it will rock, but I also think it's not going to be as ubiquitous across the format, nor as individually powerful as the card we covered from the cycle in the previous video, Boseiju. However, I think this card maybe even is a tiny bit underrated right now, simply because it does pale in comparison to Boseiju. But if we're talking about BG the Rock, we can run both. And if we're talking about non-green black-based mid-range decks, specifically ones that are only two-colored, like Deadguy Ale or Rakdos mid-range, you can run this as well, and Boseiju totally off-limits for you. So I think it is worth talking about, and I also, much like Boseiju, really do love the card. I find the naming convention and the aesthetics of almost every Kamigawa-based land to be an A, a solid A, very high marks from yours truly, and much like with Boseiju, the similarities are uncanny, even in aesthetic concerns, right? Because I like the promo a lot, I like the regular art a lot. Usually I'll be able to pick a favorite. With this, as with the Greenland from this cycle, I am sitting on the fence as to which art is better. So, as you can see, my friends, lots to like here, but let's really break it down. Why would we want to play this land if we do? And more importantly, perhaps, because I think it's kind of a given that you could play a land like this, what do we play it instead of, and why? So thank you once again for watching. Big thanks to all patrons. Let's break it down for you. Takenuma, Abandoned Mire. Alright guys, so the best way to evaluate Takenuma itself is actually, ironically enough, to do a side-by-side comparison with Boseiju Who Endures, because they have the same structure. They are legendary lands, they produce monocolored mana, they enter untapped. And if you're not sure why it's such a free roll to play at least one copy of basically any of these lands in a deck that predominantly wants to produce the mana that they bring to the table, that is why. Once again, it ETBs untapped, it's a land, and it has an ability. You really can't ask for much more than that in a structural sense. Of course, where they differ in addition to the color production is in what their channel ability does. So the first thing to note here is that Takenuma's channel ability is twice as expensive overall, 3 generic 1 black as opposed to Boseiju's for 1 generic 1 green. So, Takenuma's channel ability can be rightfully considered to be a late game ability. Technically, you could do it mid-game. Most of the time, this will not be your optimal play mid-game, whereas Boseiju, there are going to be all kinds of circumstances where turn 2, you target an artifact, target an enchantment, or target a Tron land or something like that. You will be channeling often on turn 2, even if it's not necessarily what your deck is designed to do, and sometimes you might even have a better destroy target whatever in your hand than Boseiju, but that's why Boseiju is so good, is because it is that emergency piece of interaction if and when you need it, whereas Takenuma Abandoned Mire is not an emergency anything except a way to bail you out in the late game. But mid-range decks do go to the late game. We do go to top deck wars, and that's where Takenuma Abandoned Mire most of the time will really shine, especially if you're in the type of situation where you're holding up some kind of instant speed effect, especially against a combo deck or a suspected haste threat, or just because you only have instants in hand. Being able to draw a land that would otherwise be dead and have something to do with it is going to be good enough in and of itself, but the fact that your channel can be done at instant speed for something proactive, that is where Takenuma really shines. And speaking of proactivity, even though it's a late game card, it is something that's proactive. Unless you are in the face of static, hard grave hate like Leyline of the Void or Rest in Peace, Takenuma gives you something to do. you're going to fill up your graveyard to the count of 3 cards milled, and then you're going to buy back a creature or a planeswalker. Boseiju Who Endures is not as proactive because some of the time your opponent will not give you any kind of an appealing target, and the best you could justify doing is spinning your wheels a little bit by like tagging a random land that may or may not even matter. Obviously there are times where Boseiju is going to be your perfect out to a key artifact or to a Tron land or whatever the case may be, but in terms of the broad play patterns of midrange, they actually pair really well together because Boseiju is just more interaction. It's another Abrupt Decay, it's another Assassin's Trophy, it's another Terminate, it's what, well, not really, that starts to fall apart when I start getting into creature removal, but you take the point, whereas Takenuma Abandoned Mire is just a little bit more grindy power, and crucially, I can't say this enough, both of these cards just help you curve out exactly as you otherwise would, especially if you limit them to a one-of and you need to play them as a land. They're just as good as anything else, if not better, except in the face of Blood Moon. But that's a rare exception, and we'll dig into that a little bit more. So overall, Takenuma, not as individually powerful as Boseiju, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't warrant a slot in these 2-colored black-based mid-range decks. In fact, quite the opposite. I argue that this is a pretty justifiable one-of, but let's get into why and what its competitors are. Alright guys, so let's start talking about some synergy cards with Takenuma. I'd like to begin with Turok, because Turok can be played in Rock, in Rakdos, in Deadguy, and this card synergizes with Takenuma in a number of different ways. Number one, Takenuma, of course, bringing a card back to hand, allowing you to then invest further mana into Turok by way of the kicker, and that's an example of just something generally that can happen with any such extra mana sink on cast option with any creatures you might be using. Number two, Takenuma is actually interesting with Turok in a different way because remember, just like the other lands in the cycle, Takenuma's channel cost, the activated ability cost, is reduced by 1 for every legendary creature that you control. So Turok kind of pulling double duty in terms of synergy here, and then beyond that, it's just an example of any warm body that you can buy back, and we've all been there where if you can just find anything to turn sideways, or anything to block with for that matter, you're still in the game. So all in all, some really decent synergy. Another example of decent synergy is Unearth, simply because if you've got Unearth in hand, you can always cycle it, but it's more mana efficient and more powerful most of the time to actually unearth something, and Takenuma can fill up that graveyard nice and easy for Unearth. In fact, you could even hold up Unearth, hold up Takenuma. Remember, those activated abilities are both at instant speed, potentially while holding up removal as well, and really have a lot of tactical flexibility with options like this. But then we get into some more color-specific thinking, and I have to start with good old Rock, and some staples of good old Rock. This could be Boomer Rock, Cat Rock, whatever. You've got Goyf, you've got Skoos. When you are self-milling, you are growing the Goyf. When you are self-milling, you are providing more fuel for Scavenging Ooze. These are two examples of how Rock can benefit in terms of self-mill being a way to kind of increase threat quality. You're not getting direct card advantage or anything like that, and it's no guarantee that if you've already got a decent-sized Goyf that it will be any bigger after you self-mill, but it sure doesn't hurt in terms of making these threats more impactful. Moving on from there, we could talk about Lurrus once again as kind of something that could be played in any of these 3 decks that we're mentioning. Obviously seen a ton of play, and obviously just putting more cards into the graveyard gives you more potential buyback options for Lurrus, and indeed, if you've lost a Lurrus, it's a way to buy her back as well, potentially very, very powerful in this regard. And then Deadguy Ale specific, good old Lingering Souls. This is where we start into getting into real card advantage types of play patterns, where you are milling over a copy of Lingering Souls, and then you get basically half of a spell for free. Again, this all comes from a card that is a land when you need it, so Lingering Souls is kind of the signal that we can start really deriving good card advantage, or at least functional card advantage, from Takenuma, but I think it gets even better when you're dipping into Rakdos, because then we've got Kroxa, and Kroxa is arguably the #1 beneficiary. Once again, it's a legend, so if you happen to have a Kroxa on the field, then your activation cost gets cheaper. Now, that's definitely win more, but it's something worth remembering, just for nothing, if for no other reason that you don't forget when you're playing in paper. Your legendary creatures, always remember, they reduce that channel cost. But beyond that, of course, it can be tough to fill up the bin sometimes for Kroxa, especially if your opponent's chipping away at the graveyard. So not only filling up the graveyard for an existing Kroxa, but putting a Kroxa in the graveyard in the first place, this is backbreakingly powerful in Rakdos, and then that's not where the graveyard synergies end. In those colors, of course, you can mill over a random Spyro to get a few free tokens to help with clogging up the board, buying time, or even turning sideways to end the game, depending on the board state. So there is synergy, as you can see, with the threat suite of any of these 3 decks, but I think Rakdos emerges here as the clear winner, so far anyway, when we're talking about creatures and how they synergize with Takenuma. Before we move totally on from creatures, I nearly forgot to give the monkey his due. Obviously, Ragavan, arguably the most powerful creature we've mentioned thus far, and obviously fantastic with Takenuma in general. You are, in theory, if you're connecting with Ragavan, you're generating mana, and you're reducing the cost of the channel via his legendary status. 2 different ways to make the activation that much more efficient, and you're that much less likely to need to deploy the land as well. So between that and between Ragavan's card advantage that he can generate for you, then you're able to really abuse Takenuma's channel, and you are just outscaling your opponent like nobody's business. Again, in that instance, maybe a little bit win more simply because Ragavan unchecked is probably winning you the game somehow anyway, but it's even better with Takenuma involved as opposed to most other lands. But staying on the subject of Rakdos, some things to consider. We established, I think, pretty well that the Rakdos creature suite benefits the most from Takenuma relative to Rock or Deadguy, but other considerations of the Rakdos include the fact that Rakdos plays Blood Moon. And when you're talking about a Blood Moon deck, #1, there's less room for legendary lands or non-basic lands in general. #2, they're less likely to be active, but that applies, of course, to the battlefield, so this doesn't really hurt Takenuma as much as it hurts other legendary lands, but the point still kind of stands. You can make your deck a little bit too red by accident if the Blood Moon comes at the wrong time. And the other thing to mention here, of course, is that Boseiju is going to be everywhere in the format, thus your Blood Moons get a little bit worse, and your basics get a little bit more necessary. So there's a lot to consider there, but I think Blood Moon has already been a bit on the decline anyway, and maybe Takenuma helps just edge that a little bit more out of contention for Rakdos than it has been. And Blood Moon has always been a meta card. It will wax and wane as needed in any given meta, but of course, replacing a basic swamp is always a big question mark when you're talking about a legendary land, even one that enters untapped, and with Blood Moon potentially in the mix, it's just something you really need to give a second thought. When we're talking about Rakdos in particular, the land Shizo Death's Storehouse is actually a pretty interesting competitor for Takenuma Abandoned Mire. They are both legendary lands, both Kamigawa themed, both entering untapped, but Shizo pairing with the aforementioned Ragavan is very, very powerful. Giving fear early on for a very cheap activation cost is actually highly impactful in terms of getting that crucial connect with Ragavan, especially if you're against an opponent with low curve spells that you could maybe get a little bit of card advantage, start snowballing very, very early on. So if you only have room for one or the other, this is going to depend on your creature suite as well, but, you know, Rakdos decks seem to have plenty of grinding power with Seasoned Pyromancer and Kroxa. Maybe Shizo is still better than Takenuma, but maybe you also have room for both. Now, a land like Shizo is a lot less impactful in Rockin' and Deadguy because they don't play anywhere near as many legendary creatures and they don't have as powerful on-hit abilities, so Takenuma becomes a lot more appealing in Rock and in Deadguy, both due to the absence of Shizo as a real contender and also because those decks tend to lack, the X for 1 power of Rakdos these days. I think Rakdos grinds better than Rock, and probably still grinds better than Deadguy, even though Deadguy has still some respectable 2-for-1s, Lingering Souls, Stoneforge Mystic, some hard-to-answer permanents. In terms of pure top-decking power, grinding ability, I think Rakdos has the edge, so therefore, Takenuma represents a proportionately stronger buff to the grinding power relative to the starting point for Rock and for Deadguy, but there are other competitors in this slot. My favorite in this mono-black utility slot is Castle Locthwain. And just like with Shizo and Takenuma potentially coexisting in Rakdos, especially a non-Blood Moon Rakdos deck, you could conceive of Deadguy or Rock finding space for both of these, but be careful, because Castle Locthwain does not always enter untapped. Unlike Shizo, unlike Takenuma, it needs a swamp, and presumably you're cutting at least one swamp of some kind, whether it be a shock land or a basic land, for both of these utility lands, and I just don't know if that is worth it. I would need to playtest between these two to decide which one is a better grinding tool, but I have to say Castle Locthwain repeated activation power has won me many a game on Rock and on Deadguy against control or mid-range mirrors specifically that I otherwise had no business winning, whereas Takenuma, it's just kind of a one-shot thing. That said, Takenuma, again, always comes in untapped. It's far from strictly worse. You're never gated by life with Takenuma, so just this is a very close competitor in lots of ways. I don't think you're wrong for playing either. If I had to guess right now, for Rock and Deadguy in particular, Castle Locthwain might look a little bit more powerful, but maybe if you've got a high land count, you can try to play both. Another thing to mention is our good old creature lands. Hive of the Eye Tyrant is kind of the new one, and then you've got, of course, Old Faithful, Treetop Village, Hissing Quagmire, etc. Those start to go off the rails a bit because they produce different colors and they enter tapped and all that stuff, but Hive of the Eye Tyrant can also enter untapped at least many of the crucial turns of the game, and crucially, Hive of the Eye Tyrant and the other aforementioned creature lands are not graveyard dependent, and that is actually a big downside of Takenuma relative to anything else we've talked about, including Hive, including Castle Locthwain, and for that matter, including Shizo, even in the decks where it's not as effective. Takenuma is going to invite graveyard hate that little bit harder onto you than basically any other utility land otherwise would. And these utility lands, of course, a big appeal to them is that when your main game plan is somehow being disrupted, they can help carry you over the line. If you're facing down a Rest in Peace or something similar, unfortunately, Takenuma is a dead draw, whereas many other utility lands could be game-winning. Alright guys, I hope I've given you plenty to think about with Takenuma. I didn't have much time to prepare this video, so it's very possible I overlooked an important synergy card or an important land to bring into the mix in terms of the utility land competitors and comparisons. That's what you guys are for. I'm only one man, I can't do it all. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'd appreciate hearing what you think of this. I think this is a totally fine one-of in any of the two-color mid-range decks. I'd probably avoid it in Jund and in Abzan, at least until we have time to play plenty with the more powerful Boseiju to see whether it's really worth shoehorning these into any deck that can conceivably make a case for it, but for now, I think it's enough of a free roll in these decks that I would never call anybody wrong for playing a one-of. Now, I think Rakdos is probably the clear winner, specifically a Rakdos list that either doesn't want Shizo Death Storehouse or can accommodate both Shizo and Takenuma as one-ofs. I think that's the best bet. I think if you have to choose between this and Castle Lock Thwain in your Rock and Deadguy list, it's going to be a tough call. Anyway, guys, those are my thoughts. I look forward to yours. Thanks again for watching and for supporting the content. Please do check out the other content, including the great times I've got going on with Skyrim. If you need something to put on in the background or something to chill out with, it's a great old time. I hope to see you there, and I hope to see you in the comments below. Until then, my friends, take care.